We can get started. Okay, great. Um, all right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We are live here from Opus Studios, whatever you want to call it, here for a really incredible webinar, Speaking Up and Using Data to Earn a Seat at the Executive Table. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what exactly this webinar is about and why we felt it was such an important topic. Wanted to start with just introducing myself. I'm Rachel, the CEO and co-founder of Opus, and inviting you all to just a couple of things to remember. This is an interactive webinar. It means questions are welcome. Drop them in the chat. Comments are welcome. Please make sure that you're using that because you've got a whole bunch of experts in the room who are ready to answer your questions. Do I have questions? I have a ton of them. But you've got three very different perspectives here. So please feel welcome to use that chat liberally. If you would like to keep your question anonymous, just let us know. We're happy to do that, and we'll just read it out aloud. If you want us to shout loud and proud who you are, we're happy to do that too. So please feel welcome to do that. There's also a live call-in feature. So if you'd rather speak than write, you may do so. And a reminder that if you are interested and want to expand on this topic, we welcome it and we'd love to collaborate with you. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today before I introduce the panelists, because I think this will kind of set context for why I wanted these people in the room. There's three key areas that we're going to focus on today, really around this topic of getting executive buy-in and speaking up. The first is getting data-driven ROI models. What this is about is really how do we develop really compelling financial models and projections and performance metrics that quantify the business impact of learning and development. And we need to make sure that those projections are catered to a C-suite decision maker, which is different than how we might present information to management or a colleague. Second thing I want to make sure that we're covering is building really grassroots L&D advocacy. I was thinking about how to frame this, and it came down to identifying champions across your departments, giving them resources and talking points, and creating a more formal structure from that advocacy to influence decision makers, which really does start with just being scrappy and asking around. And then third is designing curriculum and mapping these frameworks internally. A fancy way of saying strategy, and creating those processes and tools to really systematically align your content in your training with company-wide strategic goals, and making sure that whatever you're doing from a training initiative is aligning with what those trends are and what the department KPIs are, so that ultimately you can make an even bigger case for what you'd like to do. So that's a lot of what we'll be focusing on today, those three themes. I'd love to take a moment to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to do a little exercise where they talk a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get moving on some interesting data. So first we have Kelly Saunders. Kelly is the VP of Learning and Culture at Smashburger. We have next to her, up, down, I don't know who's seeing what, Angelina Sabatini, Director of Training and Development at Ford's Garage. And lastly, we have Mike Nalley, Senior Director of Operations Training at Choctaw Nation and soon to be Director of Hospitality at the University of Texas, which I'm very interested in because this man is about to get a fresh start in advocacy and needing to defend his case for learning and development at UT. So you've really got the whole spectrum here on this call. And I welcome any questions for our panelists, again, that you might have for them. But to start, I'm going to let them speak up a little bit about themselves, a real quick intro. Maybe, Angelina, you can start. Tell us how many years you've been in hospitality and 2 words to describe who you are.
Okay. I have been in hospitality almost my entire life. Actually, my grandparents owned a neighborhood bar and restaurant in Scranton, Pennsylvania, home of The Office, in Southside Scranton. So I've grown up knowing hospitality and being in the industry as a professional. I've been in the industry for 20 plus years. And then I think, can I pick three words? Is that okay? Okay. I
Yes,
would say I am ambitious, tenacious, and I am a mama.
I love it. Um, so I used to do five, and then I dwindled it down to three. And then everyone, when I did three, asked for more. So if I do two, everyone asks for three, and it's perfect.
There you
So expected behavior. Thank you. Mike, how about you? How many years in hospitality and a couple of words to describe yourself? Oh, I think you're on mute, Mike.
For many different hotel brands, universities, and as you said, we're launching a new hospitality management program at UTA and University of Texas in Arlington. And my three words are better, stronger, faster. I'm always focused on those three elements, especially from a training standpoint and also from an education standpoint as well.
Incredible. And fast, too. It's
Yeah.
almost like it's an ethos there. Kelly, what about you?
Hello, everyone. I have been in hospitality probably about 30 years, started right out of college. Have been in the learning space 28 of those years. My three words I'm going to take are lifelong learning and passion.
Mm.
Those sum me up pretty well.
And I love the concept of lifelong learning too, because it doesn't just come down to the lifelong learning, the continuous learning that we're providing to others, but what also we're developing as professionals, which frankly I don't think gets talked about enough in training. What we're doing to create our own systems and develop, you know, more advocacy internally around the power that training can have on an organization.
Great.
You know, I always talk about this, and maybe we can go to the next slide just to kind of level set here. There's some really interesting data that we collected in partnership with the Council of Hotel and Restaurant Trainers chart. And, you know, since this session is all about data, it felt appropriate to start with some data. We asked training leaders where they need more support. And what you're looking at here is what those answers were. What I think is really, you know, you'll see field level buy-in as the top line there, but what I think is interesting is that only about 30% said that they need more executive level buy-in. So this question comes up to me where, you know, why are we actually focusing on executive level buy-in if only 30% are saying that they need it? Many of you on this webinar and our panelists likely feel like you're more of a translator between executive management and those field teams. Or maybe you feel like the middle child, trying to make everyone happy. I wanted to level set with this because the goal of this webinar is to give you more tools to align with the executive team, align the executive team with the field so that you can see better outcomes and better initiatives. So yes, we will talk about analytics and insights. I promise. But it's equally important to be thinking about the strategy in which you use those analytics and insights. That's really what this conversation is about. So let's just start with the basics, though, here. You know, Kelly, maybe we can just start with you. And I know you and I have had some conversations about this, but what are some reasons why execs are not aligned with the field team in the first place? And frankly, vice versa.
I think there's a couple of contributing factors that I see. One is that it is with the pace that our industry continues to have to change and innovate at, it's hard for the executive team to stay as in tune with real world activities and real world demands of what the operators are really having to deal with day in and day out because of all of the change. So finding the time for executive teams to be able to spend time in the field, get frontline with those individuals that they're supporting and understand the needs, that's hard to create that time in that space.
So it's a lot about the time. Things are moving faster. Businesses are moving faster. It's harder to kind of create that that connectivity. I know that we've had this conversation before. Mike, one thing that you mentioned previously, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that um, at Choctaw and maybe at UT, you're using surveys as a means to really understand where that misalignment or where that gap is right now. Let's call it a gap analysis. It is what it is. Are you still doing that today? Any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially at Choctaw, we do it annually where we go through and do a survey of management and then also line level to really determine what their needs are. But we then have to interpolate that and share it with the executives. In many cases, it kind of resets their perspective because they may not necessarily think that the needs that are being brought up by the line level staff are really something that they would be normally within their preview or their concentration from that executive level. I think a lot of times, and I mentioned this the last time we did this, was that I think a lot of the executives 10, 15, 20 years ago were at that lower level as they were ascending into their positions, and they remember how it was 20 years ago. And to Kelly's point, the industry's changed in 20 years. It's not the same as it was. So getting them to kind of reset their perspective a lot of times with that data or with that information can be very helpful for them to understand, they will go across the street for 50 cents more an hour if, they don't have the benefits or the support or what have you. And the data shows that. So I think that helps reset their or helps them take the mind shift to think about that from that different perspective of employees.
Yeah.
Well, and that's certainly one way to get it, right? By just getting that top line at the start of the year, doing that survey or what have you, just to collect that information. Angelina, I'm curious to hear from you. Obviously, executives are the ones who are driving the priorities, or we hope they are in the organization, but what are some of the ways that I know you're on the ground a lot. How are you balancing corporate priorities with what the field teams really care about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, being in full service, there's a lot of moving parts, right? With all the things that we've got going on. I think part of it starts with the corporate team or the executive team versus the field have two different focuses, right? We talk about strategic planning being strategic long-term focus on the executive side. So that's, your 1, 3, 5 years out. When we talk about the field, they're immediate. Everything is instant for them. It's very short-term thinking. It's geared around the guest experience, what they need to get done, very task-oriented. So going out into the field, talking to our operators, talking to our franchisees, talking to the managing partners, as well as our hourly team members, it's really what can we do to help you to make sure you're successful every day? And what can we take off your plate or what can we make easier for you to provide that best experience for the guest and holistically the best experience for you as a part of our team? And then tying that back into what is our 1, 3, 5 year plan? Where does that really fit in? But I think it really starts with two different focuses or two different ways of strategy thinking. And if we can bring those two together, it becomes really harmonious.
Well, and one thing that you bring up is 1, 3, 5 year plan. Almost all executives have one, or we hope they do, but we can't always share it publicly with the team. So being able to drill down and just kind of meet people where they are at the field level, GMs who have what have you, and share the near-term plan, but just making sure that it pipes back upstream is really important. Again, I'm saying all of this to just reiterate this concept of translation, about how the thesis here is how do we take the data and translate it upstream, but also downstream. Sarah, can we change slides here? I just want to talk a little bit about this bridge that we're building. We're talking on the theme of why execs are not aligned. Here's the sticky part. So let's get into the kind of the challenging piece here and talk about personalities. There is such thing as a CEO persona. I am one of them. And one of my favorite questions that I asked a whole panel of CEOs one day was, how would your team describe you? So it's known, right? But in order to even begin to think about navigating how to advocate for a program, you have to think about the audience. And so there's different types of CEOs. There's, dare I say, the legacy CEO who has, is more traditional. Mike, you sort of referenced that earlier. There's, and then there's more forward-thinking CEOs that are very tech-forward. And then there's CEOs who are really visionary, creative, they're brand-focused. They don't even want to think about the numbers because they have somebody else to run that. And so I'm curious to hear, Kelly, I see you smiling. How do you even begin to think about tailoring types of data to those three personas? We'll dig into this more later, but like, what's the top line there for you?
I think the top line for me is, because I've worked with different types of personas and different CEOs, is you really have to focus on what's in it for me or for them when you look at that persona. So what is the real motivating factor for that individual that matters, whether it's numbers, whether it's behavior-based, personality-based, employee, taking care of employees. Dial into that one motivating with them for your CEO, and just make all of your communication align to tell that story.
And the WIFM, or the what's in it for me or the what's in it for them, is so critical. Mike, anything to add to that? Maybe referencing what you were talking before, what can we expect when we're talking about maybe advocating for a learning management system to a CEO who is a little bit more traditional in their thinking? Mike, can you go off mute?
Screen, and I think moving forward, we need to paint a holistic picture of what that really looks like. I mean, it's very easy to look at data and jump to the wrong conclusion. So if you have different data sources, whether it's the surveys or whether it's your guest experience or all those other data points that we were able to collect, I think our job when we get to the presenting it to the CEO is presenting a whole picture, not just the raw data. They want to know how do they interpret that? What does it mean to them? And I think to Kelly's point is, really knowing what drives them from a CEO perspective. Is it that they're building their legacy? Is it that they're more numbers focused or more people focused or whatever that is? And being able to present the information to address and help them make that decision. They're looking at the people that are working with them to help them make the right decision. And I think a lot of times, we just can't go in and dump it on their desk and say, here you go. Here's the data, here's the holistic picture, but here's also what we see as the trends, as the need, or as the direction that we should be moving in conjunction with our vision, mission, core values, whatever that might be. And ultimately allow them to say, okay, yeah, I agree. Let's check the box and make the decision. If you go in there and want them to, do the number crunching for you, I don't think you're going to be as successful. I think you got to be, as Kelly was saying, really understand who they are, what they're looking to accomplish, but also provide the information in a way that it's going to help them make that decision and be successful.
I still remember as a very young training manager many years ago, doing that. I was making the case for a new program. It was a small program. There wasn't a ton of budget, but I felt really strongly about it. And I remember presenting the numbers to my CEO at the time. And she said, give me 3 options to choose from. Mm-hmm. I had just compiled this big thing, and I'm used to book reports, or I was like 19, and it was a really small business. But what I learned from that was, to your point, Mike, you have to present your perspective and your recommendation as a mm-hmm. leader, and from there expect the pushback. So they're looking for you to be opinionated and looking for you to have perspective. Rather, it's really exhausting to make decisions. Mm-hmm. And having somebody else think that through for you is a gift. It's okay if they're pushing back, because you're actually giving them some time to time back. They don't have to think through.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think it's better, best, and then, optimum, or however you want to
I love that.
categorize those
Yeah.
three. Here's the bare minimum. If you really want to go the skinny route and not spend any money, we can do that. But here's a long-term projective and how to be successful.
Yeah.
So I want to keep moving and talk a little bit about, okay, so we kind of know the basics here. We know what it means to get some of that data up front around employee surveys and things like that. We know that we need to be thinking about the audience. One thing I want to talk about is what we're actually advocating for. I referenced a learning management system, but Angelina, maybe we'll start with you. Can you give an example of a few things that you find yourself needing to advocate for, whether it's small or enormous initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing I have to advocate the most for these days in the world that we live in is probably technology, especially around modernization and impact of the organization as we grow. I think when we talk about legacy leaders in the previous conversation and other things, it might not be everybody's skill set, but how do we get them there? And especially in all levels of the organization, you talk to a team member today, they're like, give me the app, give me the quick video, let me do the thing, and let's move on. Where we've got directors of operations who might have been used to the old legacy learning management system where it was 2-3 hours worth of content, click through all the things. And so I think the perspective and what we're used to is very different. And so advocating for technology these days is definitely on my top 3, especially in operations. Learning management system aside, I think I've got that checked off my box. I'm sure you could agree on that. But now it's talking about online ordering, right? We have a legacy system that just we're not thriving. It's thrive or survive, and we're probably surviving with the technology. It's fine. It's not great, but how do we get to great? And so those are where I really spend a lot of my time.
And there's huge downstream impacts on the training side with other pieces of technology that might not be an LMS. We were talking before about, Mike, your title at Choctaw Nation has the word operations in it, operations training direct. Like it's happening right now that as training leaders, we're expected to have perspective on more than just the LMS or the instructor-led training or whatever it is we're doing. And you bring up a good point around just technology in general, that we're expected to have those points of view, Angelina. Kelly, anything to add to that around the things that you find yourself needing to bring to the executive desk?
Yeah, and I think it ties both of those your comments together, and that is I find myself advocating for training labor, for the labor to actually train and develop our front line. With the pressures of cost of labor and that impact on the P&L, really quantifying for our executives what behaviors have to be trained, what has to be developed, and the impact in the overall performance of the restaurant has been really where we've been focusing a lot of time.
That's interesting. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, because the last thing an executive wants to hear is, I need more labor dollars. But there's ways to do it, and there's ways to advocate for it, which we'll talk about now. I really want to talk about what are some of the actual tools that we can use to make the case. Is it about data? Sure, but how do we get the data? So I'm curious to hear, Kelly, I'll keep you moving on this one. What's a good example of when it's the right time to use a pilot? And when is it not really appropriate to use a pilot?
We like to do pilots. They help us first learn what needs to happen to execute at a level of greatness, but then also build the business case of why we need to do it. I believe pilots really are important for any initiative that you're going to push into the front line that's going to affect operations, because you need to gain that learning. I think one example I could bring on why not to do a pilot is sometimes we have to do some compliance training. We have to do specific things just because we have to do it. That may not warrant a lot of time spent on a pilot. except for the fact that you could still gain learnings on how the end user reacts to that compliance training and maybe package it a little bit different. We use pilots to help us identify what the training does and how that training supports specific key results or KPIs that we're measuring, whether it be turnover, whether it be sales increase, or overall guest satisfaction ratings. That's why we use our pilots, to learn from it before we take it to a whole system launch.
Well, and you bring up something really important here, which is what are the KPIs for those pilots? We have a question from Michelle here. She writes, for pilots, how do you create measurable outcomes as proof and easy for executives to understand, right? There's 24 metrics we could pull from a pilot, say around advocating for more labor or a new piece of technology. How do you pick, and maybe Mike, I'll toss this to you because you were referencing the business case earlier. How do you pick the top 3 KPIs that matter when you're in a sea of KPIs?
Well, I mean, in hospitality, I think the number one has got to be guest related, right? I mean, that's who we serve. That's why we're here. The other thing is, again, depending on who's driving or who the decision maker is, because it may not always be the CEO. It could be a senior VP, or it could be, a division head or what have you, and really understand, what's their the focus. If it's operations based, revenue always comes into play, right? From payroll or saving revenue or what have you. So if we're going to be able to do this pilot and show the potential gain or savings in a certain task or whatever the program is we're rolling out, that could be a great opportunity to give more support as well. And, and Kelly's point, I think we use pilots to kind of test the water to see, is this really going to work? And, in training, rarely do you hit a home run the first time up the bat. There's always going to be changes. Programs always evolve, right? So what can we learn from that pilot? So when we do roll it out for the entire company, it's going to have a better impact and also going to gain more acceptance as well. Plus, we also use from, as you were saying, for those key KRAs or KPIs, we also look surveys and get the responses back, whether it's verbatim or also just the overall sentiment from the people who went through the pilot, because that's going to be a really great indicator on how it's going to be utilized and accepted from a brand perspective.
You bring up this really important component around training where oftentimes the 2 high level metrics with training are we saving money or are we saving time?
Right.
And very rarely can we make the argument that training is making us money, except when you tie it to guest feedback and guest sentiment. Then you can start to tie it to star ratings, which are very cleanly in line with how you can help the business generate more revenue. So I love that you led with that, Mike, because I think there's a lot of newness around that concept in training. We, for the past 20 years, training has really kind of sat under the HR pillar or in the HR pillar, and that's been it. We're sort of a little black box there, but now that it's opened up and we're cross-training and we're working with different departments and we're called upon all the time for new initiatives. Angelina, you just referenced a new online ordering system. It's really important. Emily here talks about the fact that advocating for labor is important for them too, and for her. So I'd love to stay on that topic for a minute. How do you make the case for more labor when you're trying to also help a business make more money? What are some of the things that you put forward in order to advocate, not just for the tech, but for the people behind it? That one's for everyone. You're doing a lot of pointing right now.
I'll share a thought. One approach that I've been taking specifically around service training is outlining key behaviors that we are going to train and attaching those key behaviors to guest sentiment results. So what you have to do to really show that value is you have to be specific about, I'm going to teach how to do the Sullivan nod. I'm going to teach how to smile and have open-ended questions. If you attach those behaviors to increasing the Google star rating by so much in a certain period of time, that's how you start gaining trust and credibility to why training is making movement or making change.
So it's almost like, the things that you would expect out of what you all just shared is P&L, labor, all of these things. But a lot of what you're talking about is storytelling. How do you narrate the journey from this singular, service training initiative to something much broader? Angelina, do you mind if I poke you a little bit about this guest or the online ordering,
Absolutely.
or frankly any initiative that's just training adjacent? What are your thoughts on that sort of narrative and some of the metrics that you're looking for to make the case upstream?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that the labor dollar is just going to get more challenging in the future as we continue, right? It's not going to shift. And I understand the philosophy of you need to spend money to make money, but how do we use that where the impact is softest, and more digestible for our partners and the restaurants? Online ordering is a great one. If we can simplify this for the guest experience, what comes back is pocket fold. Another example of some things that we're working on, because we are full service, is liquor, beer, wine training. We have very big bars in our restaurants. If you're not familiar with Ford's Garage, we typically in any of our restaurants have anywhere from 25 to 40 taps of draft beer, plus a full back bar and 6 wines. So it's a lot of programming and a lot of sales. And so we have to educate our teams and tell the story. And so something that we are getting ready for is, and something I'm really pushing for, is March is, Women's Month, right? Women's history and all that. So we have some really great brands that we feature in our restaurants where they're leading women brands, whether it's, 2 wines on our tap, or a female winemaker who was just featured 40 under 40, and telling that story to increase those sales, to spend those dollars to then make the profit up on the back end, or even thus creating extra profit, of selling that extra glass of wine. Or, we just rolled out some new bourbons, and we've got 2 specific bourbons that are geared. So I think in the way I've designed the program to come out for the following years, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about those stories, because when the team members can share those stories, they can sell more. Working with a third-party vendor right now to pilot and talk about craft beer. If I can get one team member to sell one more craft beer per shift, it'll pay for itself. So there's no inherent cost. Well, what is it if they sell 2 or 3 more beers per shift? And what does that look like? And how do we really drive our LBW percentage up 3 points when that's even more profitable than just food alone? So can we drive additional profits to our bottom line, in a more easy, digestible way?
Well, and coming back to the topic of pilots, is that a program that is pilotable, or is it the type of thing where out of the gate you're saying, listen, this is happening in March, here's my case for it, let's rock and roll?
No, I think it is definitely pilotable, especially because I work in the world of franchise. So I not only use pilots, just like Kelly and Mike alluded to, from a training perspective, but I also use it as a collaboration tool. So I always like to pilot in multiple different markets within multiple different franchise partnerships, so that I can get their buy-in, so that they have a seat at the table. And I find that when I provide the franchisees and their management teams a seat at the table early on, the ability to be able to execute that program nationally is a lot easier, and a lot easier to sell than to the executive team that I included everybody. We had different thought partners. This is how we got here. Everybody's bought in at certain levels. Going back to finding those advocates for you, and who they might be, and finding them throughout the pilot process as well, helps definitely get it across the finish line.
It's a great point. And I would actually put that in the bucket of maybe this is a stretch, so feel free to push back, but getting that advocacy through franchise partners, which many large multi-unit brands have. In fact, it's rare to find a brand that doesn't have a large brand that doesn't have a lot of franchisees. There's your third party data. It's almost like that's what you're using outside of corporate to make the case. It brings me to my last question around pilots, which is, are any of you using outside sources? Are you comparing to your neighbors? Are you looking at what, Dunkin' Donuts is doing down the street to make that case? And get how do you get the numbers? How do you get the data?
Well, from a turnover standpoint and an employment workforce standpoint, we use Black Box, which is now Guest X. Yes.
Yeah,
And
that's XM, I think. Yeah.
XM, thank you. And that data is very helpful to help us understand how we compare to the fast casual segment, which is where we sit, how we're performing, to help us bench on what targets we need to go after to try to make change, and how much work we really have to do with our turnover, with our employees.
So you're using really a trusted industry source that's aggregating all of that data to pull from
Correct.
it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of GuestXM, are there any other sources that you all use to advocate for any specific initiatives?
Well, we use the research that Chart provides annually, and we also look at information provided by the National Restaurant Association, American Hotel Lodging Association. You can go to other industry websites, and they'll have certainly, Forbes has research data. There's other industry research entities that provide that. But for us, also, it's seeing how, from a tribal perspective, how are the other tribes doing it as well. We get together with different meetings throughout the year with them, with different associations, and it's networking, it's talking and saying, okay, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And, what can we learn from that? And we find in many cases that we're on par or better than most from that perspective. And so it gives us some satisfaction, some credibility to be able to use that as leverage or use that as a communication tool to the upper management, saying, look, this is what we've been able to accomplish. This is how we compare to the other, from a benchmarking standpoint, to the other organizations or tribes. And, this is what we need to do in order to stay competitive or stay and be able to move beyond that from a organizational perspective, and also use that as an attractive device from a recruiting perspective as well.
You bring up an interesting point around almost thinking about size appropriateness too. I think one thing that comes to mind is, Angelina, Kelly, are you referencing data from publicly traded companies where we know the info is there because they have to post their earnings every quarter? Are you looking at the Portillo's data, or is that just not relevant because they're too large?
Yeah, when we look at targets that we're trying to compare against, we stay in our fast casual segment, and also look at the size of the brands and making sure that we're comparing apple to apple. But a lot of times the question will come, okay, they're achieving these sales targets, they're delivering on great Google reviews, these other brands are doing this. Who are they using? What LMS are they using? What are they doing for their training programs? And that's where we really kind of start, is identifying who's performing where we want to be and understand what they're doing that we may not be thinking of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We utilize NAP research as well. So where do we fall within our competitive set? And that is typically, our competitive set is managed by our VP of marketing and all that. But we really utilize that data. We might be lower unit volume in the number of units, but our unit volume in relation to dollars competes up there with the Outbacks and the Texas Roadhouses of the world when we talk about unit volume. And so we look at it from two different perspectives, where we want to be in Kelly's, to Kelly's point, and then where do we fall in competitive to dollar, and where we think we fall within that brand metrics.
Can I just add one thing on that? And another caveat of that, and I did it at a previous brand when we benchmarked the training with the other brands that were in our comp set, and what we found that as aligning that training and taking that and showing it to see how we stack up against them or how we are more competitive to them also helps us in our franchisees as far as getting more franchisees to buy into the brand, compared to other brands where they could say, okay, we're going to join this brand, and it was Best Western International. And instead of going with one of the other competing brands, one of the factors that they chose our brand was because of the training offerings that we provided from a corporate perspective, over and above what some of the other brands did. So that was a great tool for us from a brand expansion perspective.
Well, and you bring up, and Sarah, if we can move to the next slide, you bring up something really important around this isn't just about the numbers, it's also about the case study and the positioning. And I'm finding this a lot more with training leaders, is that in order to earn a seat at the table, you have to really understand your network. You have to understand your industry deeply, and you have to know the P&L. But the question is, and this is sort of the $1 million question, I think there's a lot of people watching wondering who maybe aren't like you three and don't have access to the P&L. So how do they get it? And how do you ask for that nicely? So you have the benchmarks, at least internally.
I think that's a great question. I think starting by asking nicely, and I think taking the approach seeking to understand is always a great philosophy. I would love to learn more about this because I think it makes an impact here. Can you walk me through this? Earlier on in my career, I was very blessed and very fortunate to work with a very excited, positive VP of finance. And it was for a corporately traded or publicly traded company. And I needed to learn more about EBITDA and how this impacted the restaurants, and how now being at the corporate office impacts training and our initiatives for the following year, and just really understanding that full line thread. And so I knocked on her door and said, hey, can we do coffee next week? I have a couple of questions for you around this. So it gave her time to prep and understand kind of what I was looking for. But I think, taking that approach to seek to understand, I'm looking to just know more, do more, because it's what's in the best interest of the brand or the organization. I think a lot more people are willing to take the time and kind of mentor you through that process.
Mm. And that context setting is so important too, so that you're not shocking someone and saying, I want to dig into your numbers. And giving them some time maybe to filter out the things that, they don't want to share yet or aren't ready to share because that trust hasn't been built yet. So speaking of trust building, I wanted to move to this slide because let's fast forward a little bit. So maybe you've done a pilot, you've made a business case upstream around how this is going to help the business make money. It is August 27th. We are about to enter one of the most critical points of the year. If your fiscal year is the December 31st, most executives are going into strategic planning right now. They're starting to think about the year ahead. So whether it's this time of year or not, I'm saying it, but more just to kind of understand, can you tell us more about your approach as it relates to strategic planning, and maybe some advice for folks who are listening around, should we be making the case around strategic planning? Should we be thinking about it 6 months earlier? Like, how do we think about that where the high level priorities are from a time perspective against what our departmental priorities are?
My reaction to your question is yes, we should be thinking about the higher level strategy. What I think is what can be daunting about strategic planning, especially from a learning leader standpoint, is there's a lag in a way, right? Because you really need the executive team to lock in the top high level strategic pillars or what's really critical before you can think about what that does to your learning organization, because you have to then determine what are the behaviors, what are the programs and initiatives that will help support those pillars. Very rarely do I find myself in that early part of that conversation. The pillars have to exist first.
Hmm. It's a good point. And it makes me think a lot about that sort of concept we talked about earlier in the call, which is around just visibility. Like there's only, sometimes you're only getting 80% of the picture and you have to work with that. But sometimes there's ways that you can potentially line it up to know, I need 100% visibility now in order to really make the case, and just being patient until you have what the strategic direction is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also in knowing your training and also knowing the ebb and the flow of that within the organization. I mean, all training, if you do it initially, it's only going to have a bump for so long on that S curve. You're going to peak at some point, and you're going to have to go in and do retraining. When is that within the organization, and are you planning for that? Are you making a business case for that? Too frequently we look at training as a one and done, and not the marathon or the ongoing learning that we talked about. And when you're looking at it from a budget standpoint, it's not just, okay, we need to roll out this program. We also need to sustain this program. We also need to invest this program and let them know from an executive standpoint, this is not a 1-year program. This is a 3-year, 5-year program if we're going to do it correctly, because not everybody's going to get trained the first year. You're going to have turnover. You're going to have all these other factors that need to be involved in that. So I think a lot of times, especially when I've had projects and so forth that have come to me, and I'm like, okay, so what's the long-term effect of this, and also what's the long-term investment of this? And a lot of times we forget about that. We always want to get it approved initially, and then next year you go back to the table and say, hey, we still need money for this. And they're like, what do you mean you need money for it? We already paid for that. So I think you've got to build that strategy in and let them know that, like, look, this is a 3-year, 5-year plan, or whatever that is that makes sense for your organization, and let them know that this is an ongoing expense that's going to be that they're going to have to be able to provide.
Well, and it's a lot of that ties back to being comfortable and ready to share your wins and your progress. I was thinking about before when we were talking about pilots, sometimes you have to pilot twice or 3 times. But a pilot mitigates that risk that the organization is nervous about, and a pilot is an opportunity to let you fail. Like it's okay if it fails, but it can kind of tee up what those potential wins could look like. So that's kind of the pilot example. But to your point, Mike, around being prepared for the long haul and being ready to collect that data as you go to continue to make the case is often forgotten about. So I'm curious to hear from each of you, how are you telling that story over time to continue your advocacy for whatever programs you have in place? How are you sharing your wins? Angelina, maybe we'll start with you.
All right, great. We utilize sharing our wins in our team meetings. So we do what's called a PAM every Monday, project alignment meeting, where we align internally at the franchisor level. And so we'll share some of that there. We also like to share it in our monthly newsletter out to the field, things that we've accomplished. It's always a great opportunity to then thank whoever helped in the pilot process and call them out and recognize them for their efforts, because we pilot probably a lot of things for an organization our size all at once, whether it's we are testing a new menu a year in advance. So we've got pilot locations for LTO specials for 2025. We're in that process of doing tastings and things. So we've got tests for that. We've got tests for online ordering. We have pilot locations for training. all the things. So making sure that they feel recognized and understanding that their contribution matters in that way. Another way is to celebrate them in their own space. When we're out in the fields and doing restaurant visits and celebrating the team internally and getting even their entire team, right? Because we don't want to recognize just the partner or the managers. We want to recognize everybody because it was a team effort. We're one team. I couldn't do it by myself. And I really need to recognize everybody that helped me get that across the project, across the finish line.
Well, and just to play devil's advocate here, that makes a ton of sense to me. It's a team effort, and you want to be sharing those wins because then you can build the advocacy, right? And more people will get behind you if you're building that. But how can I share the wins about myself and what I did to move this forward so that I am trusted more? Does it continue to come back to just like sharing the team wins, or is there anything that's really kind of isolated to you and the work you've done too?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's harder to advocate for yourself in that regard, or celebrate the wins and be boastful about that in a professional way where it doesn't come off as bragging, right? So I think there's probably a fine line, but I do like to say that in our team meetings, this is what I've accomplished for the week, or this is some things that I've gotten done. Here are some projects I'm proud of, and this is why, and kind of walking our team through that. And then that kind of gets shared. We also do a corporate conference once a year for our teams. And so I kind of get to share that, whether it's through a breakout session of saying, hey, this is what we did, but this is how I kind of did it. We have some new leadership changes here within our organization as well. And so now with those changes, I've had to go back and actually talk to the things I've done. Sometimes I get viewed as maybe the director of miscellaneous. If it doesn't have a home, it just comes to me. And so I think people don't realize that I've contributed to that project. So I do have to advocate more for myself, but I will find that it is a bigger area of opportunity for me personally to do so.
It reminds me of something I think I heard the training director at Piata Group talk about once, where, and this is, I swear I'm coming back to center here, but it's a little tangential, where he talked about how in a one-on-one throughout the week, it's really important to listen before you have your one-on-ones with your team and write notes about what you're witnessing throughout the week, because you're inevitably going to forget. And so write the good things you see, write the opportunities for feedback that you see, and get ready for that one-on-one rather than waiting for that pinnacle moment when there is a leadership change and everything goes crazy and you don't remember anything. So getting those testimonials as you go, creating space, 10% of your time to just watch and listen and record, and then aggregate later and, do the other thing, what you were talking about around corporate events and all of that. I love that. Angelina, you shared so much. I'm curious, Kelly, Mike, anything to add to that around sharing wins that you do in your organizations?
For us, I'm sorry, Kelly, I'll just jump in. I didn't know if you were going to say something. I don't want to cut you off, but for us, we track the residual effects of training. To us, training is a push-pull. Initially, you push it out. People have to do it. People get accepted or what have you, and then they start pulling things back from you. So when we develop a program or roll out a program, we build that credibility, we build that accessibility, and then we find that after we've done a program, we just opened a new resort this year. After opening that resort, every department now said, "Oh wow, I didn't know you could do that. Can you do this for us? Can you do that for us?" We have more requests, so that helps justify the labor. It also helps justify the different projects that we're doing. But we also track that and say, okay, this is the effect of the training, positive, that we're building more credibility, more requests for training from our area, and that's been very positive from us to be able to show what the demand is, also what the acceptance is from an organizational perspective.
Mike, that's huge. FOMO works. Kelly, what about you? How do you share your wins?
I'm going to tag back into the one-on-one example. What I do on a weekly basis as a leader, our company uses Asana, a project management platform. I have a one-on-one board for every single one of the individuals that I lead, as well as the teams that I interface with. And I will create lists of examples of great performance or great impact from learning of projects that we're working on into those one-on-ones, so that they are timely, and we can talk about what we've seen the last 7 days, and that really resonates. And that's, I believe, how you build that trust and that credibility of being that solution provider for the individual, whether it's the individuals that you lead or the teams that look to you for support.
What a great way to cap everything off around just bringing it back to the front line and the people where we're trying to make the most impact. So we are at time. I've got a lot more questions we will not have time to ask. Kelly, Mike, Angelina, thank you so much for your time today. Sarah, if we can skip forward on the last slide here. I'd love to talk a little bit about what's coming up next at Opus, really on the theme of developing advocacy and presenting data to get the projects moving that you need to. On September 26th, our next webinar is really about, okay, we're scaling up. How do we create consistent training for NSOs, for new store openings? And I hope that some of you will join us there and take some of these learnings to that as well. I know 2025 is going to be a big year for the industry, and there's a lot to do. So especially on the theme of strategic planning, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter if you've not. Lots of great tips in there for training leaders, operators that are unique to the industry. So thank you all again to our esteemed panelists. Very much appreciate you and your insights. And thanks to those of you who joined us today. I'm Rachel Nemeth, and we are Opus Training. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.